Good evening, and welcome to a virtual conversation that will focus on the past year as we maneuver through COVID 19, a pandemic that had an impact on each one of us in the city of Indianapolis, the state of Indiana, the United States of America, and yes, the world. This past year has been a challenge. It has been a challenge to each and every one of us for our educational system and the students and families that we serve. We will look at this past year as it relates to educating students in the midst of a pandemic, as well as take a look at what is needed to address the impact of this pandemic and the impact that it has had on our students and their academic success, particularly as it relates to the achievement gap, social emotional impact, and the digital divide. It has been 1 year since COVID 19, a once known unknown virus that caused symptoms similar to the common cold, but with a heightened intensity ravaged the world. Currently, there have been well over 520,000 deaths in the United States alone. However, America's health is not the only thing that has been impacted by this devastating virus. Over the past 12 months, COVID 19 has impacted education adversely, but as a community, we have seen some positives that have come from this medical crisis. This panel discussion this evening features local educational leaders who will share the negative and positive effects of this pandemic, as well as what educating students look like today and what it will look like in the future. Yes, our educational system has changed, and we are eager to hear from the experts on how we will embrace the change and provide equity for all students and decrease the achievement gap. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, prepare for this courageous conversation that will lead to a greater understanding of the impact of COVID 19 here in Indianapolis on the educational system and how we will move forward. Now I turn to my colleague, Emil, who will introduce himself and our honored guests for the evening. Good evening, Emil.
Good evening, Sister Flora. Thank you so much for that amazing intro. You could speak with passion about this past year because you have been right in the trenches, in the heart of everything. So thank you so much for all you do. And thank you for leading this conversation today. We also want to thank the Indianapolis Recorder for providing a space or platform for us to have this conversation, for our community to be engaged, and also for our community to engage leaders to learn about how do we move forward and really inspect what we've been through in this last 12 months. So thank you so much, Flora, again, for that amazing intro, as usual. For those who don't know Flora, Flora is the ultimate professional. She's also the leader at Indianapolis Public Schools and leads the Future Centers at IPS, and just an amazing professional, an amazing community person. So thank you, Flora.
Thank you.
We have an amazing group of panelists today, people who have been right in the heart of making decisions for our community and our families through the entire COVID sequence, like I call it. Everyone on the panel today has had to make tough decisions, has had to sit down and listen to families and listen to staff and listen to students as they make those decisions. So we'd like to introduce our panel and start with our fearless leader. We all know her as Sister Alicia. Alicia, please introduce yourself and give us just a brief background for those who don't know you.
Sure. Well, good evening, everyone. I am thankful and very glad to have had the invitation to join the conversation. So thank you, Emil. Flora, Team IPS. Glad to be on with you. My name is Alicia Johnson. I have the great honor of serving as superintendent of Indianapolis Public Schools and have been in the role almost 2 years officially, which seems crazy because, as you all know, the last year has felt like much more than just a year. But it's been a tremendous experience that I'm so thankful for, to be a part of this community. I've been an Indianapolis resident since 2004. So this is home for me, and I just could not ask for a better opportunity than being able to serve a community that I deeply love and cherish and respect. So happy to be on with you two, with the other panelists tonight.
Thank you, Alicia. Brandon, Brother Brandon is also someone who's been, making some tough decisions right in the heart of this battle, I call it, as we try to overcome this pandemic. Brandon? Please introduce yourself.
All right. So it is just an honor to be here tonight. I am the CEO of the Mind Trust. We are a locally based education nonprofit that will actually celebrate our 15th anniversary in July. So I actually had the opportunity to begin my career as a 9th grade English teacher in St. Louis, and then have been home here in Indy since 2010. I was the charter schools director for the mayor's office, and then I joined the Mind Trust in 2015. So I'm just really excited for this conversation tonight.
Thank you, Brandon. Another person joining us is someone that does a lot in the background. Patrick makes a lot of things happen. People probably don't know Patrick by face or name, but he's in the background just working his tail off. And Patrick, please introduce yourself to the community.
Hi, everybody. Patrick McAllister. I'm the director of the Office of Education Innovation. OEI oversees 45 charter schools that serve well over 18,000 students. My background is in education and education policy. I ran a nonprofit for a little bit here in town. I worked for the State Department of Education, but my happiest career moment was as an English teacher at a mayor-sponsored charter school way back in the day. So excited to be here and contribute to this conversation.
Thank you, Patrick. And last but not least, another person that is always in the background, but always working. I've never seen him not working, right? But Amar is someone that's doing a lot of things in our community. Thank you for joining us, Amar.
Emil, thank you. First, just want to say thanks to both you and Flora for moderating tonight, and thanks to Robert and Brandy at the Recorder for hosting this important discussion, as well as Jahada Garrett at Purge Strategies, who helped make this happen as well. Glad to be with here and amongst friends. So my name is Amar Patel, and I serve as the Executive Director of Teach for America here in Indianapolis. I'm a Hoosier native, born and raised in Terre Haute, and I began my career in education like Patrick, Brandon, and Alicia as a teacher, and started through Teach for America. For the past 5 years, I've served as executive director of TFA here in Indianapolis. We recruit, develop, and support outstanding and diverse recent college graduates who are equity-minded to make an impact, to partner with communities in transforming education and transforming education outcomes, starting in the classroom. And so here in Indianapolis, we've been on the ground here for about 13 years, and all told, over 700 TFA core members, what we call our first and second year teachers, as well as alumni here in the Indianapolis areas, as well as all the panelists alongside me here. So pleased to be here for this discussion, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Amar. Well, we have so much to cover and very little time to cover. So many questions, so many things the community wants to know. And we'll start with our fearless leader, Alicia. Alicia, I just want to start by saying, how are you? I could just imagine your inbox on a daily basis and just the things you have to deal with on a daily basis for the last 12 months. And, I know I speak for a lot of community members when we say we pray for you as a leader. But just want to start with that. How are you and how's your family?
Well, I appreciate that question, and I appreciate the prayers. So please keep them going. I can feel them truly. I am well. I am fortunate to be healthy and to still be able to do my work each day. I'm fortunate to be a part of a great team of folks at IPS who are working incredibly hard to make things happen against all kinds of challenging situations and scenarios we found ourselves in. So, overall, I am well. I, get a little tired here and there. Every day brings a new adventure. That's been my saying this year, is every day is an adventure. But I'm thankful to be on the adventure, particularly with the people who I get to do the work with. So, and my family as well. So we are fortunate, again, to have our health, to be, in a home and taken care of, and not wanting for much of anything. My parents are now vaccinated, so they were able to visit us for the first time in a year yesterday, and that was a wonderful treat. So doing well today.
Oh, that's great. Awesome. Alicia, IPS is the largest school district in the state, and IPS also has a majority minority student body, right? At this time last year, we were all caught off guard with the pandemic. Our whole world changed. Society as a whole really got a chance to see how much we rely so much on K-12 education, how important K-12 education is on everything we do across the board with the disruption of the school day. How did that immense responsibility weigh on you as you try to make decisions for your school district? You had so many people looking for you to make decisions that benefited them, right? But you still had to make the decision. How did you make the decisions you made, or how did you go about making those decisions with so many people looking to you to make a decision for them?
Yeah. I mean, it is amazing to think through a year ago. My team and I were looking at some of the emails we sent a year ago at this time, when we just didn't know how different the world was going to be. I think we had to quickly prioritize, like what's going to be most important for our students and families right now. Our main core business obviously is educating students. So how do we figure out how to educate when kids are not in buildings? Was sort of core question number one, followed by, we also know, we're one of the largest food providers in our city. And so and we know so many of our families rely on us for meals. And so how do we also make sure we can pivot to support our families in that way if they need meals, particularly since we were all sort of, at home and shut down, and folks were losing jobs just so quickly. So those are the two of the things that we thought about sort of immediately is how do we provide education? How do we provide access to that education? That meant turning into a mini technology logistics company and getting laptops out of elementary schools to get them to our high school kids, literally mailing them via USPS and UPS, working with Patrick and others to get hotspots to kids so they can have internet access. Like, the digital divide just became even more glaringly apparent during this time. And then how do we take care of those other social needs our kids have in terms of their own health? So meals and childcare where we could provide it, and information about what we were experiencing with COVID. There were so many things we didn't know. And so how do we help use our major platform to communicate and share information with our families, which is a really important role we play.
So Alicia, you mean to say there wasn't a playbook for how superintendents deal with pandemics, for you to go open up and go through as far as how do you handle a situation like this?
Not a class available. Nope.
So when you looked at your core group of trusted advisors, like who was in that core group, would you say, of people that you just relied on just to get information or just ask questions to on a daily basis?
Across our community, we saw a lot of these like collaborative groups start to form because we wanted to be sure we were sharing information when we had it so that everybody was positioned to succeed. So obviously my team, the chiefs who sit on my team we were meeting literally twice a day, beginning of day, end of day, just to be sure we were all on the same page and moving our work along. And that was for multiple months with that level of touch points. Working with across Marion County. So I referenced Patrick earlier in the e-learning group that we formed that was really focused on addressing technology, and then working with Brandon on, okay, like once we got a little bit through this, how do we think about community learning sites and supporting the learning that students need to have? I'm very fortunate to be a part of a couple of national networks like the Council of Great City Schools and Chiefs of Change. Those were invaluable networks So I was able to talk with other superintendents about what they were experiencing in their city. And then even our Marion County superintendents, we convened a weekly meeting to just make sure we were all staying in contact about what was happening in our respective areas. So, I think that's one of the benefits of being in Indianapolis. One of the things we do quite well is coming together to be sure at the end of the day, everyone can do their work well and that our kids in our community are best set up.
Thank you. Thank you, Alicia.
Alicia, this is awesome. I love your answers. I love the collaboration that you're speaking of. I think it's phenomenal. So I'm going to flip it a little bit here, and I want to ask Amar a question. Without our teachers, what could we do? So I know that you're with Teach for America, and you recruit, you develop, and certify aspiring teachers. So I want to know, how do you do this?
Sure. So, and Flora, are you asking specifically sort of in as a result of COVID, or more broadly?
Just more broadly, how do you do it? And then I'll ask you a few more questions, but just how do you do that?
Sure. So appreciate the question. So, the first thing that we do is we go across colleges and universities and professional workplaces all over the country. Over 400 colleges and universities, for example, all of the HBCUs, big state schools here in Indiana and elsewhere around the country, and we're looking for leaders on those college campuses, those that have had a diverse array of life experiences, schooling experiences, and who believe that it is, in fact, it should be a human right that all children should have access to an excellent education, and know that far too often that is not the case, especially along lines of race and class, right? And want to get in the game and make a difference to solving this problem in the near term, as well as over the course of their lives, right? And so we identify leaders on college campuses and those that are early in their careers, and compel them around the idea of becoming a beginning teacher in a community serving brilliant and beautiful children all over America, including right here in Indianapolis. We then train them over the course of the summer before the first fall of their teaching here in Indianapolis, as well as over the course of their 2 years in the classroom, right? If you ask any beginning teacher, I'm sure the four of us here would say this, it is hardest, in fact, in those first few months or those first few years as a teacher. And usually that's when most of the support that teachers that maybe had multiple years of training or maybe a shorter run, such as with TFA teachers, that's when they need the support the most. And so that's a big part of our ongoing training and support model for beginning teachers. We have coaches in classrooms every week, every other week, observing, providing coaching support, and expecting progress, right, within sort of a high expectations culture. And then ongoing, we believe that great teachers, if they have that interest, should continue teaching for their lives and careers, if that's where they see making an impact. We also recognize that the problem of educational inequity is systemic, rooted in systemic racism, legacy of systemic racism and present day systemic racism, and therefore is going to require systemic solutions to address it over time. And so we, of course, support and encourage alumni of our program, those that have successfully completed those 2 years teaching, to go on and become principals, new school founders, lead big school systems, such as the case here, which we're thankful for at Indianapolis Public Schools and elsewhere. And so that's how the how, what and the how of the model. I'm happy to talk a bit about COVID if that's of interest as well.
Okay, well, let me just kind of jump in real quick, because all of these amazing things that you're saying that you're doing, and that you're going on college campuses all across the nation to find teachers that are aspiring teachers and get them engaged in the teaching profession. So you're saying that there's a need here in Central Indiana for educators? Is that what you're saying to me?
That is what I'm saying. We probably, just by way of context, and maybe Alicia or Patrick, Brandon might have some further data here, but we could probably place 2 or 3 times, maybe more, the amount of incoming TFA teachers that we bring every year without much of a problem. And that's within our focused geography that we've had for the past 13 years, which is largely IPS boundaries. Now, if there was interest, outside of IPS boundaries, I think the demand for incoming teachers generally, and TFA teachers specifically, I think would only grow.
And you did say that you are on HBCU campuses. And I know that our listeners are saying, yes, we need teachers, but we need teachers of color. So are you making a concerted effort to make sure that you are reaching those demographics?
Yeah, so last year, 50% of incoming TFA teachers across the country identify as people of color. And just by way of context, that included those that applied to join Teach for America. Almost 1/4 of seniors at Spelman applied to join TFA. And so we are, across the country, the largest developer and trainer and supplier of teachers of color, bar none.
Okay, awesome. And then my final question to you, Amar, how has the pandemic affected teacher retention and recruitment?
Yeah,
it might have.
yeah. So this was a big question. Our set of challenges were nowhere near the set of challenges that Alicia just walked us through in light of COVID. And it's quite humbling to hear all of the types of complex questions and challenges that she and her team were facing. But we had a real question about a year ago. Now, at the top of the pandemic, we have been recruiting all these incoming TFA teachers, and we still had a couple more recruitment deadlines to come. Will these folks still join us? Right? This is very different than, say, when they applied to join TFA last fall. Next fall school year might look quite a bit different, and their training over the summer might look quite a bit different than what they would have imagined. The result, though, was really inspiring. We actually saw a 15% increase in terms of incoming TFA Indy core members relative to where we thought we were going to be in February of 2020 before the pandemic. And the reason was two big things. One, these folks were saying, boy, if there's a time to make an impact in schools, if there's a time to get in the game, and I'm seeing all these disproportionate impacts on communities of color in particular, the time is now. And so put me in, right? And so there's almost this kind of call to serve mentality. And then second, a lot of incoming TFA teachers usually have lots of other options, be it within education and outside of education. I think there was probably also a sense that some of those other opportunities may soften up a little bit, right? So that probably had a bit of an effect. But the result was we brought in 15, just a little bit shy of 20% more incoming TFA teachers here last year than we thought we would.
Awesome, thank you. Emil.
Thank you so much, Amar. Patrick, today as I go around the city, right, it amazes me that I talk to people that still don't know what the Office of Education and Innovation is. And I'm so amazed by that. So could you please just talk about the Office of Education and Innovation? What is it? What do you do? And just explain that to our community and audience, please.
Yeah, so the Office of Education Innovation primarily is a charter school authorizer. And what that means is we oversee independent nonprofit public schools in Marion County. A charter school has a nonprofit. They have a contract that allows them to operate, and we hold them accountable to that contract. We make sure that they follow the law, and we also make sure that they meet certain performance standards that are set out in their contract. And so we've been around for about 20 years, and we have about 45 independent nonprofit public schools within our portfolio of schools, many that we share with IPS as innovation schools. And all told, those schools serve over 18,000 students in our community.
Wow. I read somewhere where as we looked at equity across the country, where your office here has more Black and brown school owners per capita than any other city in America. Now, I don't know if that's gospel data, but could you talk about how that's happened in your watch? How were we able to get as many Black and brown school owners into position here in Marion County?
So I think if we want to have teachers of color, it's really helpful to have leaders of color who have strong visions for what their schools ought to be. I'm not sure the exact number as we compare to the rest of the country, but during Mayor Hogsett's term, 75% of the school leaders that we authorize new schools for have been people of color. Those are principals and CEOs of schools who have the decision-making power about how their school is shaped. They decide the curriculum for their schools. They decide who they hire. They decide what roles they want to have in their schools, and they decide how the money is spent for their schools. And so I think that charter schools play a critical role in bringing more leaders of color into positions of power so that they can make decisions that affect students in our community.
Thank you. What have you learned through this year with your schools? Like, just going through this with your leaders, your staff, students, the community as a whole. What was, if you had to iron down on one thing you've learned about your schools, what could you point to that just kind of woke you up about the makeup of your schools and how they've handled the situation?
So I think trust is so important to having for schools to run well. That's true outside of the pandemic, but it's so much more true during the pandemic. We've had to have schools adapt on a dime. They've had to, as Superintendent Johnson noted, we had to turn around everything. We being the schools had to turn around everything in the spring, had to become meal service providers, had to become technology experts. These were a lot of changes really quickly. And the only way that students really are able to experience those changes well is if there's trust between the school leader and the families that they serve. Those who don't have strong trust built between those two struggled more than those who did. And so I think trust is just such a key element, both during the pandemic and after. So,
and I'll let you go with this, so the correlation between having Black and brown school owners and leaders with, like we talked about, a majority of minority student population, did that help increase the trust between your leaders, staff, and the community as a whole?
Sorry, I had my mute button there. Yes, I think absolutely. When something didn't feel right in terms of decisions, often the school leader of color was the one who brought that up. And often they were able to approximate what their students needed really well. Now that's it doesn't mean that white school leaders can't do that. It just means that they have to work extra hard to better understand the communities that they serve. So I think having leaders of color leading charter schools is really important.
Especially during times like we just experienced.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Flora?
Yes, Brandon. I am so excited to talk a little bit about the Mind Trust and how it works to ensure children have access to high quality education and schools, especially the students of color. So if you could just briefly tell me and our listeners a little bit about the Mind Trust, and then I'm going to ask you a few more questions.
Sounds great. So at a high level, our vision is to ensure that all kids in our city have access to a good school. We work to accomplish that in a variety of ways. One is we recruit and support great school leaders to go launch new schools. Two is we provide a range of supports to a growing number of existing schools in the city, and really ensure that they have robust teacher and school leader routes to really make sure that the highest quality educators are serving our kids. And then three, perhaps as important as anything, really work to engage the community. There's been a lot of changes in the education system for the last 10, 12, 20 years. And we need to make sure that this is not something that seems like it's being done to communities, but really making sure that we're working with and on behalf of communities, and that folks on the ground level who are directly impacted by all of the injustices are leading this work over time. And we want to do all of that work through a racial equity lens to really make sure that we are really trying to interrogate what's currently true in our education system, and how do we start to make sure that we are working to dismantle racist systems and really try to replace them with ones that are more equitable. Yes, that's the Mind Trust.
Awesome. Now, next, the pandemic has adversely impacted all students. We know that. But we know that our Black and Brown students are behind their white peers academically. And so I'd like for you to explain to the audience today, what is the achievement gap? And since it exists with our students of color, how has this pandemic increased that gap, if it has? So I'm going to let you just kind of take that and share.
It's a great question. You know, one thing that I learned in the classroom is that brilliance is equally distributed across all kids in our society. And what's not, though, is opportunity. So when we talk about an achievement gap, what we're really talking about here is an opportunity gap. And, you know, generally speaking, there is not real equity and opportunity across our education system, which then translates into massive, you know, and real disparities. You know, one example here of what I would call an opportunity gap. So we have a school district in our city where if you're in third grade and if you're white, you're 8 times more likely to be identified as high ability relative to if you were Black. That's in third grade. So if we know that brilliance is equitably distributed and opportunity is not, then we really need to start thinking about what are the opportunities that we, you know, truly have for our kids, and then how do we make sure, you know, at all levels of the system that we're, you know, really thinking about how do we provide more equitable opportunities so that we don't have the long-term academic disparities. One thing that was mentioned earlier is it matters the level of expectations that our classroom teachers hold for our kids. And we know through experience and research that if you're an educator that reflects the racial background of your students, you're more likely to hold higher expectations. That's a fact. You know, again, it's not that white teachers can't hold high expectations, but we have our own internal biases, you know, that we have to work through. And I was looking last week at some data. So if you look at Marion County as a whole, there is a 56 percentage point gap between the number of kids of color we're educating versus the number of classroom teachers of color. 56 points. So, you know, if we want to work towards a more equitable system, we need to make sure that the leaders and the educators that are actually serving our kids more closely reflect their racial background. And this is not just a challenge across the state. This is a challenge right here in our own community. You know, so what are we going to do as a community to make sure that we're working with schools of education, that we're, you know, working with a variety of programs to recruit and support and retain high quality leaders and high quality educators that reflect our kids? We know that anybody can be a great teacher, but we also know that it is super important for our kids, right, to have windows and mirrors and to see themselves. And there are school districts in our county where you could be a Black child, go through a K-12 academic career and not have a single Black teacher. That's a travesty. And, you know, we really need to tackle these issues head on and be honest about them, and then work collaboratively, you know, to really get towards real solutions.
This is amazing, because this is what we call courageous conversations, because we're speaking what is really happening. And if a child can see it, they can be it. And if they never see it, they don't believe that they can be it. So I think that everyone in this conversation today is talking about what the issue is and how we can make those changes. So I'm excited about this conversation. Emil.
Thank you so much. Powerful words, Brandon. We could talk for another 40 minutes about what you just talked about. You were preaching just then, and hate to get away from that because that was such a powerful topic. But that leads into this question perfectly, right? In the 2 years preceding or leading up to the pandemic, right? The state of Indiana, for lack of better terms, canceled or kind of erased the test scores for our students. Then we got into the pandemic, obviously last year, and not being able to test. And then obviously this year. So if you're a 7th grader, you're 11th grader, you've been through 4 years. The last time you actually had your test count was in 7th grade, right? Or if you're 7th grader, the last time was in 3rd grade. What happens with all this testing and assessment, and how do we assess our young people today? So if I'm an 11th grader, how do we really know where you are right now as an 11th grader? And how's the district kind of looking at that, Alicia? How are you guys trying to grapple with that, with everything you're dealing with right now?
Yeah, I mean, because we've seen so much change at the state level was why we moved 2 years ago to adopt sort of our own interim system. So we use NWEA MAP. It's used by a number of districts across the country. It's a national normed assessment, computer-based, it's adaptive, pretty similar to what I learned was the last time we took that. Because you need more, first of all, than that one summative data point at the end of the year for a teacher to actually have data that's useful to them in informing what they're doing in their classroom. So we added NWEA, which is 3 times a year, so we can see where our students are in the fall, at the beginning of the year, how much they've grown in winter, and then how they've done in spring, which again gives you a more sort of consistent view of your students, and also allows you to see the amount of growth they've experienced over the course of the year. We know, again, that if I take IPS, we're not going to magically jump and have, 90%, 100% proficiency in 1 year's time. But what we should be able to see is growth of every single one of our students year over year, at least 1 year. And quite frankly, given where some of our students are starting from, that is not enough. And so how are we overcompensating the amount of growth we want to see our students making year over year so that they get to that proficiency? So we've had to build those systems into the district at our level, and then obviously talking with our teachers about, what are those daily assessments and checks for understanding that they're doing in their classroom so that they can see, hey, 8 of my students got this lesson, 5 of them were still struggling. I'm going to pull those 5 tomorrow for a small group and review the skill we worked on to make sure they're staying with us so they can differentiate their lessons appropriately. So it's really a combination. You sort of get the snapshot from the state that tells you some stuff, but isn't necessarily able to be leveraged immediately. You have our district level assessment that's happening 3 times a year that gives more robust information. And then you have teachers in the classroom on a daily, weekly basis assessing so they know where their kids are. And it's not really about just sort of testing kids all the time. It really is about having an accurate pulse on where your kids are so that you can accelerate their growth if you need to, review things when you need to, so that you make sure they're moving steadily along the course of the year.
So based on the student demographic makeup of your district and also Patrick, the charter schools, I'll use a name. Little Johnny mom contracted COVID, lost her job. The grandma also lost her job. They can't get food at home. And now I come to school and I have to also worry about a test or take a test. How have you seen your students during the last year? Kind of, what does your assessment show as far as student performance with everything that your students have been dealing with? And now coming to school and have to, anchor down and take a test that's going to reflect on their capabilities. What have you seen and how have you been able to handle that?
Yeah, so in IPS, we've really mirrored what we've seen play out nationally. So nationally, we've seen some pretty substantial dips in student achievement in math compared to where you would normally see at this time of the year. That has been true in our district as well. The dips haven't been as substantial in reading, but still some loss in terms of reading. And I'm saying loss in terms of where students would be on average around the same time. Students haven't made as much progress. So we know it's a fact of the matter, having had such a disrupted year, learning in all kinds of different situations, to your point, different contexts that are happening at home, those things have a tremendous impact on a student under irregular circumstances, let alone a circumstance where I'm not as connected, to my school or my teacher, or I'm at home this day and back in school this day. It's had a tremendous impact on our students and the progress they've been able to make this year. So I know we are all thinking deeply about how you accelerate student learning to fill in what we know is some of those missed learning opportunities this year.
Wow. So Patrick, what are some of your school leaders in our local charter schools saying as far as how they're dealing with, because I picture IPS and Alicia and IPS has some resources behind the district, but a lot of your schools are standalones, and how are they handling such immense pressures and things they have to deal with their student base and the community they serve?
So it's different depending on what school you're looking at. I think that's part of what's true about charter schools. Many of them have been developing either in partnership with initiatives like the Mind Trust or independently, rigorous summer learning processes so that they can make sure that their school community has the resources that they need to help try and close the learning loss gap. But it's difficult. Our schools had to adapt to make some quick changes. They had to teach remotely, which is, I would argue, significantly less effective than being in the classroom with the teacher. I'm not a parent, but I'm sure all the parents who had to also kind of go along with their students and make sure that they were learning throughout this year, it was difficult for a lot of folks. But our schools have been incredible at adapting to the changes that they need to see. Hiring the roles that they need to hire, adopting the curriculum they need to adopt, and investing really rigorously over this summer in their individual communities to make sure that their kiddos are as close to being grade level ready in the fall as they possibly can be.
And real quick, just Amar, if you could add to that as far as what you're hearing from your teachers, because I can only imagine the teachers have seen all of these things. They're doing this remotely as well. And now they're also being judged on the student performance on the test, right? So it seems like so many forces working against the teacher actually doing the good job that they want to do.
Yeah, I think I mean one thing I think we heard from Alicia and from Patrick just now is sort of that assessment. The virtue of assessment is equity. Right? We can't respond and meet our students' needs if we don't know where they are, and we certainly can't strategically, with a equity focus, direct resources to help get kids where they want to be if we don't know, right? And there's a lot of conversation around the country, as there has been in our state, around the value of assessment. In the pandemic, before the pandemic, there have been forces that have been sort of against assessment in general. And I would just name that the virtue of assessment is equity. And, you know, sometimes I don't want to eat spinach, but I should probably eat spinach sometimes, right? And there are times where, I don't want to get on the weighing scale, but I probably do that every once in a while to sort of understand kind of where I'm stacking up. And so that is not to say that we shouldn't pursue more precise and holistic forms of assessment. Sure. But we have to know how the children are, and we have to know how we might then best determine how to get them to where they need to go. As for our educators, many, if not most of them, are saying we want to be very careful in the volume of assessment that that we are sort of giving our kids or asking our kids to take on, especially in light of the pandemic. And they will say in the same breath, we have to know where kids are. So I can have the information I need as an educator for my school, can have the information they need to direct our energy and resources to get them what they need to get caught up, to the extent that there's been levels of learning loss. So that's what we're hearing across the TFA community over and over and over again. That's what we're hearing.
One last question, Flora, and I'm going to get up this assessment thing for you. And this is Alicia. Alicia, if the only metric we're using to identify, for lack of better terms, where a kid is, right? So that metric also says you are ready to move on, or you are able to go compete for jobs. If that's the only thing we have to point at a young person to affirm them as far as how good they're doing or what they could possibly be good at, how do we look at that? I think Amar said it well as far as equity. Based on our demographics of young people and how much we know that we have to pour into them to lift them up and affirm them. And now the test score comes and the kid didn't do well on the test. Now the kid feels like, I'm not going to make it. I didn't pass this test. But it seems to happen so much, right, to our young Black kids, where the test seems to be what we use to show them, are they ready, are they not ready, are they good, are they bad? What are your thoughts on how do we use other tools to help raise young people up?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. You fundamentally can't use a test score as the measure of goodness or badness, right? Or of your brilliance and the strengths you have and the ones you don't. I took a physics test right now, you would say, "Woo, she's not very smart." But you probably gave me a writing passage of some kind, I'd probably do all right. So we all blossom and have strengths in a multitude of areas. So I think it's so important that we're not drilling down our kids to be represented by a number. Like, we are all more than that one point in time or that data point. It's why I'm like very excited about the work that we do, that Flora helps to lead. We start with our middle schoolers in a program called Naviance, where they're really doing like career exploration and what am I good about, or what am I good at? What do I enjoy doing? What does that mean for what I might want to do later in my life? Our high schoolers continue to go through that process as well, so they can understand, what am I suited to do? What do I enjoy doing? What might my interests lead me to do? So that, again, they are creating a more full identity of themselves, partnered with what also has to be true are the adults and the teachers and the educators and the school staff in their lives, also pouring into them, pushing them when needed to say, nope, you can do more than that, and I'm going to help you get there. Or you need to consider this thing that you may not have thought about, but here's why I think that could be great for you. So it's incumbent upon us, and we as the adults are responsible for making sure our kids know they're more than that data point, though that is a data point that informs us in the work that we need to do as educators, but also to pour into them and to say to them, like, this is what I believe you're capable of. I'm going to walk alongside you to help you get there. But we're going to stretch and we're going to push because you can do that.
Is that something you train in a teacher? Is that something a teacher has innate in them?
Some teachers come already with that built. That's a part of sort of who they are. And some teachers, certainly it has to be something you develop. And to be quite honest, you can't develop it in everybody. But I think something Dr. Payne says all the time is children will rise or fall to the level of your expectation.
Absolutely.
And so if we want to be very clear in Indianapolis Public Schools that I expect that expectation of your children, of every single child that you are serving in your classroom, to be high, so they are rising to meet the level of their expectation. That does not mean every day is going to be easy. That does not mean it's going to come without struggle. That does not mean you won't be pulling them along the way sometimes. That's a part of the gig, but we are all responsible for holding the level of expectation of what we know is possible for our kids, which means what we know is possible for ourselves to help them get there.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And I like that, the way you ended it, Superintendent Johnson, because it's about building relationships. And when we build those relationships, we can take students as far as they want to go and as far as we want them to go, because they believe in me and I believe in them. So I appreciate that answer. Brandon, I'm going to come back to you. Going into the fall of 2020, everyone was uncertain about COVID and how exactly schools will look for students, teachers, and parents. Everything went digital immediately, all at once, overnight. We were a digital world. Talk to me about the digital divide.
Yeah, it's hard to remember, but just 1 year ago, I mean, you're right? With one press conference, we literally transitioned schools to be completely virtual overnight. And I think was mentioned earlier, there was just no playbook for this. And we at the Mind Trust, tried to work quickly to identify where were the gaps. And, I think it was shocking in one sense, but like actually shouldn't have really been shocking, that many schools in our city, there were 60% or more of their students didn't have access to a device and didn't have access to high quality internet at home. And when you're transitioning overnight to be completely virtual, think about an equity gap. Right? Thousands of kids in our city literally didn't have the ability to access high quality instruction virtually. And if you think about a lot of the communities surrounding Indianapolis, right, you better bet that was not the case. And there are structural reasons why there are certain neighborhoods, certain families who lacked access, and then there are a lot of other families who didn't. So, it was quickly apparent that this was a massive challenge and that it was going to take a community-wide effort to really make an impact. So I think a lot of people really stepped up in our community because we're a community, that really likes to rally together. to, really figure out what's the problem, and then, how we, at least in the short term, try to really close these gaps. And I think through a lot of those really collaborative efforts, I would say within a couple of months, we were, kind of as a city, really able to ensure that all kids had a device. We were really able to ensure that all kids had access to high quality internet at home. Now, what I would say, though, is that all of those solutions were short term and they're not structural. And it's the year 2021, and the internet, high quality internet at home, ought to be a right. It ought to be viewed as a utility. It should not be viewed anymore as a privilege. You cannot access the 21st century economy. You cannot be a full participant in the 21st century world without access to a device and without access to high quality home internet. So what that means is that we need to think as a community, how do we solve this problem long term? How do we get all 150,000 K-12 students in our city access to reliable internet forever? And then, how do we make sure that we are working with our legislators at the state level and a lot of our leadership at the national level to see this as a human right as well? Because right now, the systems aren't actually set up to ensure real equity for everybody when it comes to accessing virtual learning. And while I think through the effort of our community and school leaders and superintendents across the community, we have solved these gaps in the short term, but we got a lot of work to do to make sure that we're solving them systematically over the long term for all kids.
This is awesome. So, Superintendent Johnson, I just want to ask you a question. When we look at the social emotional effects of the pandemic, and we want to be honest, as we've been all evening, studies have shown how students, even well-adjusted students, have struggled significantly. Describe the social emotional impact of the pandemic on our students.
Yeah, I have my superintendent students advisory council that I meet with monthly that you're well aware of. And one of the conversations I had with one of our students on the advisory council, and he was talking about having been in his house, for months, that in his particular neighborhood, he can't really go out and sort of, chill outside on the porch or just hang out. So he's been in his house, and his desire to want to be, back in his school or with his community or, anything to sort of be in a different space and place where he could be more connected with folks was so strong. And, that was a few months ago, and it just struck me how deeply he felt like if I just had the opportunity, to just be in a different space, be with my classmates, be in an environment where I can be connected, that relationship was really lacking for him. And he was able to articulate so well the impact it was having on him and his experience in the year. And I think that's reflective of a number of our kids, particularly I'd say in the high school space, where they have yet to be in a sort of traditional going to school every day scenario. We have a number of first years or freshmen who have yet to spend a week on their campus with all of their classmates to more deeply build those relationships and connections with one another. We are social beings as grown-ups. And so imagine when you take, kids not being able to make those connections and have those networks, it is very, very challenging. Against the backdrop of family dynamics where perhaps mom or dad or whoever was the primary breadwinner not being able to do that anymore. So we've seen a number of our high schoolers who need to pick up hours at work and are now having to balance, when they're in class along with working to help contribute in their home. And the opposite is sort of the joy I've seen from our kids who've been able to come in person and how happy our little ones have been when they've gotten to meet their teacher in person and wow, you're so tall or you're so big, being able to make the connections behind the screen, which again, to me, just reinforces how important that connection is for us to have when we're doing something like educating and teaching and learning. It is deeply important. And I think that SEL work is something we're going to be engaging in deeply this coming year. And not just for our students, I should also call attention to all the things that our teachers and our grownups have had to manage. I'm teaching from my house while I'm taking care of my kids, while I'm worried about if, Andre, had to go to work. Is that why he wasn't in class today, or what's going on? And so our teachers have also had to carry a tremendous, tremendous amount of emotional sort of toll this year in navigating their own personal well-being while still showing up in professional ways for their kids every day. So we all have a lot of healing, that we all need to do over the course of these next several months and years.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And the only thing I'll add, and I know our time is going by so quickly, but I want to ask, are you providing as a district support for your students when it comes to the mental health piece, to your staff? Are you encouraging self-care?
We are. We have a partnership with Apex that does they were doing wellness before. They're continuing some of those wellness efforts, whether that's physical health, whether that's mental health and things of that nature. With our students, a number, again, of our schools were already using a social emotional learning curriculum, continuing to do those things. We've seen teachers and leaders reach out to make sure they're just building those connections when we were all closed, doing the parades by kids' houses. We did yard signs last year because we couldn't do the in-person stuff, but some of those things are going to continue again to build relationship. We're about to have a IPS Finish Strong campaign where myself and lots of leaders in central office and others are going to go, knock on some doors at homes and make sure we're connecting with kids and families if we haven't seen them for a while, to hopefully get them back, with us in school, and or to encourage them and say, hey, this is the last quarter of the year. We want to finish strong. So, continuing to try to stay oriented in connection, relationship, with our students and with our families, and with our teachers.
Awesome. Amar, if you could just tell me briefly, what are you hearing from teachers, educators regarding their social emotional health and well-being? What are some things that you're hearing?
Yeah, the first thing we're hearing is how badly teachers over the course of this full year wanted to be back in person, by and large, with their kids. While many were worried about their own health, not yet having access to the vaccine and so on and so forth, to what Alicia was just sharing, they missed the direct human, physical sort of interactions with their kids and the relationships that come from that. And they saw how, in many cases, their kids were struggling for lack of that. And so the first thing was they wanted to, get back in the classroom as soon as possible. And hopefully the health conditions would allow for that and be able to safely do so. And then the second is just teachers themselves, relationships themselves, actually being lonely and isolated from their peers at school, from, in our case, their fellow, cohort members and everything. That was something that was a major drain. And it's something we're certainly thinking a great deal about in the months to come as the vaccine rolls out and it's more safe to be kind of in physical proximity with each other.
Awesome. Thank you, Amar. Emil, you can take us home.
We have about 2 minutes, but I think we can go a little bit over. Time flies, right? But what I do want to end with Patrick, and then Brandon and Alicia can end the day and just thank the community as a whole, is education is really a people's business, right? And people have to work together and get along or come together so we can get the full outcomes for the young people we serve. But we also know that we live in a society that's so complex today, right? In your school buildings, you have baby boomers, you have millennials, you have gay, you have just everybody in our community is working in your school building today. But it's very important that we have an environment that is respectful, empowering, and structured. How are your organizations working to make sure that people are walking into these buildings and they feel empowered, they feel respected, and there is some structure in place for our young people and staff? Could you just talk about that as we end this? Just talk to the community as a whole so they can feel rest assured that these are the kind of environments our young people are walking into every day.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel. This has been a great conversation. Our school leaders always talk about the first thing that they need to ensure is that a student feels safe and loved when they're in the building. If they don't feel safe and loved and heard, they're not going to learn at the level that we need them to learn in the world that we operate in. So that's kind of number one. From OEI's perspective, our job is accountability and oversight. And so one of the ways that we are trying to make sure that students are seen and heard is to change how we do accountability for our schools. As an example, we are adopting a more culturally competent site visit protocol so that when we do go in and observe schools, we're not just looking at high quality curriculum. We're looking at curriculum that reflects the students that the schools are serving. We're asking questions about how the students feel. What is their relative social and emotional health within the school? We're looking at special education, not just through the lens of compliance, but excellence. English learning, not through the lens of compliance, but excellence. And this is going to require a higher level of work from our schools, but I think it's what our city and our community expects. So that's kind of how we're trying to help our schools move in a direction where students are seen and heard and feel safe and loved in their school community.
Thank you, Patrick. Brandon?
Yeah, so at the school that my kids currently attend, the school leader talks a lot about how it's critically important that every single child is known and loved. So really what you were saying, Patrick, how can we make sure that every single child in our city is known and loved at school? And one reflection over the last 12 months is that schools and community partners during the school day are way too disconnected, right? We have such amazing neighborhood organizations in our community who are on the ground and have amazing trusting relationships with families. And for some reason, right, the K-12 education system has really became relatively siloed off from all of those amazing assets. So through work that we've done, really trying to establish hubs in the community throughout the school year, and then hopefully through work that we'll be, helping to lead over the summer, we can start to more intentionally bridge the divide between what's happening in schools and what's happening in the broader community. There are so many assets in our communities. And what we need to do is really be intentional around how can we start to find synergies to make sure that kids are known and loved, whether or not you're in school, whether or not, you're at a neighborhood organization, and, how can we make sure that we're being more intentional around really trying to find ways to collaborate. And I also, have thought a lot about how once we get through COVID, the goal can't be, hey, let's just get back to normal, because normal wasn't working for way too many kids in our community. The goal has to be, how can we accelerate student progress at levels that was not true before the pandemic, and really, has never been true if we think about it and if we're honest with ourselves with the K-12 education system. So, what are those systemic learnings that we can take from the last 12 months? And then how do we apply them moving forward, well past COVID, to make sure that we're not just trying to quote unquote mitigate learning loss, but we're really rethinking the opportunities that our kids have and thinking about what they truly deserve, which is not going back to normal. It's actually hopefully creating a new normal that's more equitable, more just, more collaborative, so that, one day we can actually sit here on a panel and objectively say that all kids in our community have access to a high quality education, because the reality is that wasn't true 12 months ago. It's not true now, and it needs to be the North Star for all of us moving forward.
Thank you. Alicia, you could take us home and kind of just wrap up the day. But I do want to ask you this as you take us home is, I watch the news, I read the papers, and it seems like our teachers take such a beating. And from teachers being scared about their health, I'll be scared about my health too, right? Someone asks me just to come to work, and taking a beating because they ask questions about their safety. It just seems over and over like the people that we're depending on to go in and empower our young people take such a beating, and then are still expected to go to work and do a great job. What would you say to your teachers and your staff today as you look at this past year and everything they've been through, and you look forward to what's to come? How would you end this conversation, and what would you say to them, and what would you say to our community about supporting them?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing I would say and do say often is thank you. It is a choice to teach, to do the work that teachers do. And in many cases, they could be making different choices. And in fact, in many cases, they do make different choices because the circumstances and the context are such where it can be very hard to feel successful and not feel like you're sort of the scapegoat for every negative problem that exists in our society. I think that is too common, that becomes oftentimes the rhetoric that educators or teachers have to hear. That said, the job of teaching is such a serious and important job. You are literally shaping the path of that young person and pouring into them what they need for their future success. And so it's not a role to take lightly. It is very serious work. It's very challenging work that we have to take as seriously as it is. And I believe in the vast majority of cases, that is what teaching professionals and educators are absolutely doing. Rita Pearson has a TED Talk that every kid needs a champion. I would almost say every teacher these days needs a champion as well, who is rooting for them, but also pouring into them with their own development, so they can get better at serving our kids every day, which is the role they've chosen to do and want to do. So that's something we're really focused on as we think about next year. It's, how are we supporting and developing our teachers to do the work that they do well, so that we see that show up in student outcomes. But what does that mean to really deeply support our teachers, and be sure we are hearing from them, and letting what they are telling us inform the decisions that we are making along the way. So I'm thankful to have strong partners with our IEA. I'm thankful that we have a strong teacher leadership cohort who, they're advising us. I'm like, yeah, that thing makes sense. That thing doesn't make sense. And we're not going to always agree, right? We're not always going to come to the same conclusion, but having that diversity of perspectives, point of view, is really helpful. I'm proud of Team IPS. I'm proud of the teachers we have. I would say if you pluck them and put them in a different district with some other resources, you probably, have a different story to tell sometimes. They're the hardest working people you will find in many cases. And so I'm thankful to be a part of that team and to have them with our kids. But it's serious work to do. And it's work that's never done. We know we've got to get better outcomes for our kids. So that's going to require more of us. Like to Brandon's point, it's going to require a new normal. We can't keep doing what we've always been doing and think we're going to get a different result. So that is going to require us to be different. And if I'll end with this. If there's one thing that we've learned from this pandemic, is that we can be flexible. Yes. We can be nimble. We can change. And in fact, we can actually do it pretty darn quickly. And so it's no longer okay to say it's how we've always done it. It's not how we've always done it. And we can't lean on that as our rationale for not sort of doing new things and considering new ways of being. Our kids deserve that. And we're committed to giving that to them.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Just want to end by saying how refreshing it is to see leaders that are aligned. There's no question that it almost looked like you guys had a meeting before this to practice all that. But it is awesome to see, and I just say refreshing for folks who are watching. I can guarantee that they can see their leaders, and their leaders are aligned in thought and aligned in how they view our community and view our young people and what needs to happen. So thank you guys so much for all you do. Thank you, Sister Flora, for all you do. I know you're smiling after a long, hard day at work, so we appreciate you as well. But we need to have more of this, and we thank the recorder for just the safe space to have open conversation, and we need to encourage more opportunities to do this so our community continues to learn about the good work and not the sky is falling all the time. So thank you guys for coming in this evening, and truly enjoy a blessed evening, and keep up the great work.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Emil. Thank you, Flora.
Thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yes.
Have a great evening.